Okay, hello everyone to the fourth and last part of our Budget 101 series, helping to explain some of the basic fundamental structures, issues about budgeting for the State of Hawaii and for the University of Hawaii. If you've made it this far to the fourth item in the series, and this is your first time here though, I would invite you to check out the other three portions of this series that help provide you a better, more basic understanding of some of the individual terms that we may discuss today. I'm Kalbert Young. I'm the current Vice President for Budget and Finance and the University of Hawaii's Chief Financial Officer. And I've prepared this presentation for you to help better explain to you probably the most esoteric and detailed items that you would ever want to hear or learn about. And for the majority of you, I bet you will find this far more technical or boring than you think necessary. But as a financial wonk, I'll tell you, I will try and make it as interesting as possible for you because I have a very high interest and level myself for bonds. We'll talk about bonds today. What are bonds? So what are bonds? For any of us who have gone to business school, you may remember them as probably the most boring instrument and complex to stay awake instrument that you've ever learned about in bonds. Probably most of us don't really understand what are bonds, but I guarantee all of us are involved or somehow personally invested in bonds or bond instruments. Bonds are simply debt. Debt of an issuer or whoever is providing the bonds. At the University of Hawaii, we have issued a significant amount of revenue bonds of the university over the years. And the university is responsible to paying the debt on those bonds every year. People have bought those bonds, provided us money to do the capital projects that we wanted to fund with those bonds, and now we have to pay them back every year for letting us borrow their money. It is still considered debt of the university. That's the most simplest way I can put it in terms of understanding bonds. For some of the mechanics around bonds, though, I want to point out that the university has a pretty significant bureaucratic level of authority that is required before we can issue bonds. Bonds have to be authorized, or the authority to issue bonds has to be authorized by the legislature, has to be approved by the Board of Regents, and we also have to have legislative appropriations in the budget bill that identifies the use of those bonds. So it can be of a somewhat lengthy process. I mentioned to you that the University of Hawaii has a significant amount of revenue bonds outstanding. The number one source of funds for all of our capital projects is actually general obligation bonds of the State of Hawaii, not the University of Hawaii. So it is still debt, but it's not debt of the university, it is debt of the State of Hawaii. That is the number one go-to of any of our capital projects that are funded with bonds is general obligation bonds. The university in 2025, though, has something just south of $500 million worth of outstanding UH revenue bonds. That is debt of the University of Hawaii. And I'll show you a chart at the end, if you can stay awake that long, about how that debt and duration lasts for the University of Hawaii. So bond authorization is required at a number of levels. I mentioned the legislature and I mentioned the Board of Regents. There is actually university policies that explicitly identify the process that's required to issue bonds of the university. I've listed here the execution bullet points for a bond transaction. I guarantee that 99.9% of you have no experience or zero interest in the university's transactions to issue bonds. You will likely never ever be asked to participate in future revenue bond issuances of the University of Hawaiʻi. A very small team at the University of Hawaiʻi executes these bond transactions when they do occur or are required, and they do require consultation and discussions with program level facility users. For example, the university has a lot of revenue bond outstanding on our Kaka'ako campus for the John A. Burns School of Medicine facility and the UH Cancer Center facility. That represents the lion's share of the university's revenue bond debt exposure. Construction of those facilities, though, requires consultation with JABSOM, with the Cancer Center, at the time when we wanted to issue those bonds. It continues to require consultation because those two institutions are the ones that are actually responsible for providing the debt service annually to satisfy those bonds. It's the responsibility of your university CFO to ensure that the university does not default on those bonds and satisfies the expectations of all investors to meet the annual debt service. Here are some Bond 101 terms that will help refresh your memories when you've learned about bonds, maybe perhaps when you were matriculating at the University of Hawaiʻi. The first one that most of you will not care about, but the CFO cares about, is taxability. Taxability on bonds relates to whether they are tax exempt or taxable, and that has to relate to the investor. When someone buys the bond, if they are tax exempt, if the bonds were issued as tax exempt bonds, that investor does not have to worry about paying federal or state taxes on the monies they receive from those bonds when the university pays them. It's tax exempt. Some of us may actually have some tax exempt bonds. That's what it means. But it could also be taxable bonds, meaning it's treated as just as income. And investors will have to pay for that income when they receive their bond payments annually. Of course, there's a difference in terms of interest rates. So if a bond is provided at tax-exempt rates, it tends to be cheaper on the university in terms of debt service. But if those bonds are taxable, it will likely have a higher interest rate than tax-exempt bonds. Call provisions is another area that we pay attention to on bonds. Call provisions are bonds issued for a particular duration can have a period of time specified in advance where the bonds can be, quote, called, meaning I could offer to pay the investor a return of their capital at a certain point in time. And in doing so, I could alleviate myself or the university of having to pay future bonded debt service for the remainder of the duration for those bonds. In usual practice, university revenue bonds have always been issued with a 10-year call provision, meaning that after the first initial 10 years, the university can make a decision as to whether to call those bonds back, to settle the debt, and then alleviate itself of future debt service. However, executing on those call provisions, in my experience, has been somewhat rare. Issuers have not called bonds to settle them for maturity. Instead, we have used the call provisions to refinance bonds. So refinancing them for cheaper interest rates than when they were initially sold. Duration simply means how long are these bonds going to be outstanding? How long will we be paying debt service on them? State of Hawaii limits the duration that we can issue for bonds. We cannot issue 100-year bonds. We cannot issue 50-year bonds. The duration is actually 25, or in some instances, 30-year maximum duration. And then the overall structure of bonds issued in the state of Hawaii requires certain parameters or components. The biggest one is actually what's called level debt service. So when the University of Hawaii issues bonds, let's say to the tune of $100 million, that is not typically $100 million for 30 years. It is spread in increments across that 30-year duration. And when we do that, there is a requirement that the amount of debt service that we pay in any one of those years across the 30 years, for however many bonds are maturing, the amount of debt service that we pay in any year must be within a range that is considered level or flat. So there is some creativity that is required in doing the math to structure the right amount of maturities for the right duration of bonds that preserve a level of debt service that is level in a changing interest rate environment. So let's talk a little bit about the pricing of bonds. How do investors receive their monies annually for bonds? What do they consider when they want to invest in bonds? Well, obviously, bond holders want to receive their money back. They're expecting to receive their money back and then some. The then some portion is, of course, bond interest. And in bonds, it's typically in the form of coupons. Coupons where on any set prescribed period, usually every 6 months, a certain rate of interest for the amount that was lent by the bond investor is going to be paid to them. It's based on the coupon. So for instance, you may see bonds that have a 5% coupon. Well, that just means that for every year, if they invested $1 million, they should expect to get $50,000, 5% each year via the coupon. But that amount is also somewhat mitigated when you consider premiums, bond premiums. It is not typical that if someone had $1 million and was interested in investing in bonds, that they would go and spend $1 million to get a 5% coupon bond that's going to pay them $50,000 a year. That is not typical. It's a very narrow band there. What usually ends up happening, and in the case of the University of Hawaii revenue bonds, this is true, is that bonds are actually sold either at a discount or at a premium. Meaning for a $1 million bond, someone might be able to purchase or invest in a $1 million bond that pays 5% per year, but they may have to pay $1,050,000 for that bond, or maybe they'll pay $950,000 for that bond. The difference is reflected as either discount or premium and helps the investor be able to secure a certain rate of return relative to the broader interest rate market. So these are financial decisions that investors are making when they are looking to purchase bonds. For us as an issuer of bonds, it is a nuance that we have to figure out in terms of pricing, because if we are selling bonds at a premium, meaning for a $1 million bond, someone is willing to pay us $1,050,000 for that bond, that's a premium, that is a huge benefit for us. It means we will get $50,000 more in proceeds than we originally intended or expected. And we're going to pay a certain rate of interest for that, with the coupon being 5%, let's say. But if we have to pay at a discount, meaning that we need $1 million and therefore we're going to sell bonds, but we only are able to get $950,000, and we're still going to pay 5% for $1 million. That means we will be short of funds if we expected to get $1 million. All of that is the balance and the creativity, the factors and the components and the calculus that goes into constructing and structuring bonds. That is a responsibility of your chief financial officer and the university's treasurer when we issue and construct bonds. So all this to say, it is obviously a very complex transaction to ensure that we can sell bonds and get sufficient proceeds to execute and fund whatever project we think those bonds are going to be required for. To issue bonds, another factor that we have to be mindful of is the cost to issue them. There are, beyond the interest rate, there are costs to do a transaction to sell bonds. And it is in the form of paying for underwriting services. We have to pay for legal services, bond counsel, compliance services, filing services. So all of these add to the cost of issuing bonds. And when they add to the cost of issuing bonds, for us as an issuer, that affects what's called the true interest cost, because those costs are actually aggregated and spread over the duration of the bonds. And so when we ask for, well, how much interest, what is the interest rate that the university is actually going to pay on those bonds? Well, that's actually the true interest costs, taking into account discounts, premiums, cost of issuance, all of that. What is the true interest costs? For all of us as University of Hawaiʻi employees and State of Hawaiʻi employees, I can tell you the university's debt profile and all of the true interest costs, the University of Hawaiʻi is in a very good position for our debt portfolio. Yes, it is a significant amount of debt outstanding, but relative to the overall university, it's actually at a very good level compared to any of our peers. Here on this chart, this is the debt overview for the university as we stand today in 2025. The University of Hawaiʻi doesn't issue revenue bonds all that frequently. The last transaction occurred in 2020, just ahead of the pandemic. And for the amount of debt that the university has, the two biggest components are the areas to fund the medical school, JABSOM, and the cancer center, both in Kaka'ako. But both of those also have statutory authority that they receive monies from the cigarette tax, the state civil cigarette tax, and monies from the National Tobacco Settlement Agreement. So those are outside of the university revenue streams, but we are fortunate that we receive a fair amount of revenue from those two sources that go specifically towards meeting the debt service at JABSOM and Cancer Center. And up until last year, both of those monies happened to be sufficient to cover 100% of the debt service. I will tell you right now, though, in 2025, that level of revenues from cigarette tax and the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement has been dropping and has reached a point where it is now below the level of debt service. So the university is right now managing how to meet the debt service going forward, even in light of this particular revenue stream reaching levels that we need additional supplemental support to meet that annual debt service. And on the bottom part of this chart, this is the debt profile. How much debt is going to be paid until the final maturity for all of the bonds that the university has issued, which runs out to 2041. So roughly another 16 or 15 years. This is a very good profile for any bond issuer. It's declining, It runs smoothly as it trends down, and it runs out to a very near-term period, 14, 15 years. So for all of us at the University of Hawaii, we can feel good. This is a good thing and a good profile for the university. Now, lastly, and I promise you this will be the last slide, talking about bonds, is when you look very specifically, giving you confidence about the University of Hawaii, our bonded debt. This is a representation of the level of coupon interest rates that the university has been able to secure over the time that we've actually issued revenue bonds. The coupons represent sub 4% annually on average. And in the current mortgage interest rate environment, that is amazing, stellar. It's a very great level. I wish I could get a mortgage at these levels now. But that also means that the university, we are paying debt at a very preferential rate and level. So it is a good thing. I think that the University of Hawaii will have additional revenue bond debt and issuance into the future at some future point in time. And having a profile like on the previous slide where it provides room for additional debt and still allows to maintain the overall trend of the profile, that is a strength for the university. So this is the last slide, and that's my last point I'd like to make on this presentation. If you have made it this far, I commend you tremendously. This is the last of a 4-part series. It is probably the most boring part to understand and think about bonds. But if you've lasted this long to the end of the presentation, my hat's off to you. You've learned more than I bet the most of the colleagues here at the University of Hawaii. And I hope that you find these presentations useful to you and refer back to them for you to help refresh any ideas or thoughts that you may have about the budgets or questions that you may have on the university, its finances and budgets. I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for making it this far. Goodbye.